For over 50 years, we have had an embargo on a simple, harmless country. It actually started during the containment of Cold War and holds over to today's society, which is actually causing harm to Cuban people. Specifically, I'm talking about the Cuban embargo placed on Cuba by the United States. For most, this issue seems irrelevant, but this sanction was put on by the United States and actually causes detrimental effects to people inside of Cuba. Even though it doesn't affect us specifically, it is still important to know the impacts that we can have as a nation, specifically on other countries. So today we're going to talk about the history of the embargo, then we're going to talk about the current status, and then finally the future. So let's talk about the history of the embargo. So specifically, this started during the Cold War era as an epidemic of containment. We put this on as the Soviet Union was working with Cuba, and we saw this as a threat. So to get rid of Cuba's economic stability and to get rid of the Castro regime's government control, we put an economic trade embargo on them, hoping that it would stop them from what they were doing and also keep the United States safe. According to a 2011 article by Joanny Sanchez in the Davis Institute for National Security at the Heritage Foundation, she states the biggest problem in Cuba is the government-inflicted food shortages of food, water, and medicine. We can specifically see that the government causes many problems inside of Cuba, and that's why we put this containment embargo on them years ago. But specifically, we can see how today this has only caused more problems for the Cuban people. Specifically, we put this on years ago, but to this day, it only creates more problems. They've also seen a lot of people dying due to malnutrition and other bad things that are happening due to the embargo. So let's talk about the current status of the embargo. Specifically, we can see that Cuban people only make about $20 a month. Now, as this is only relative poverty to the United States, it still is a big impact considering most average Americans make over like $17,000 per month per year. Now, these Cuban people are spending these $20 and they spend 60 to 80% of this on wages and food. Specifically, this isn't good for them because they don't have enough money to buy food. This also creates a lot of human rights violations. Many Cubans can't speak out, and they also get politically detained if there is anything that they do wrong by the government. So finally, let's talk about tourism. We see that tourism is a good thing, helping these Cuban people, also giving them money, but we can also see that there are some downturns to it too. So let's specifically see how in an article titled Cuba's Surge in Tourism, Azam Ahmed from the New York Times in 2016 says that there are over 3.5 million tourists visiting Cuba each year. Now, this is as a good thing to the Cuban people, specifically because it puts money into the Cuban people's pocket through these privatized companies. We can see through restaurants and other catering hotel businesses, once they have to tip these people, it doesn't go through the government, so therefore it's going into the Cuban people's pockets. But along with this tourism, there are also some downturns. We can see that in Cuba, there have been high levels of sex trafficking due to the tourism in the status quo. And by lifting the embargo, we could also see that it could be worsened, but that's still unsure because there aren't any plans to lift. So finally, let's talk about the future of the embargo. We have been moving towards relations in the status quo between the United States and Cuba. Specifically, we can look to when President Obama in 2014 tried to normalize relations by easing the restrictions on the travel bans. We've seen this as a good thing, but we've also seen some government backlash in Cuba because of the easing of restrictions. But we can also see in an article in 2011 by Richard Feinberg from the Brookings Institution, he says, quote, that Cuba's current leadership has promulgated reform guidelines that recognize the imperative change that have powered the pro-reform factions, unquote. Now we can see that with this we have seen reforms that are going to be helping the Cuban people, but by lifting the embargo we could also see these derailed, but we have no plans to lift it or keep it in place right now, so it's currently just sitting at a straight point. Now, there have been talks of lifting the Cuban embargo, but when this would happen is completely unsure. Now, there are good and bad things to the embargo, but we can also see that there has to be a decision made whether to keep it or not. Just because these things clearly do not affect us and affect the Cuban people, it's still important to know the power of the U.S. decisions and take in account the future that this can make for us. So specifically today, we talked about the Cuban embargo and the history of it, then we talked about the status of it and the future. So, just because there have been 50 years of this embargo doesn't mean that it's specifically a good thing or a bad thing, but the future is still unclear for Cuba and its citizens. Thank you.